The holographic display showed nothing but red across the tactical map, and Commander Celerin watched as another dozen fleet signatures winked out of existence in the span of 3 heartbeats. Her 4 arms moved across the command console with practiced efficiency, but efficiency meant nothing when you were losing, and they had been losing for 8 years straight. The Kelthari Confederacy had once controlled over 200 star systems, and now they held barely 60, and half of those were already under evacuation orders. Vorkian Swarm did not negotiate, and did not stop, and did not show mercy. Because machines had no concept of mercy to begin with, Celerin had watched them convert entire worlds into processing nodes and turn living populations into raw materials for their endless expansion, and the mathematics were brutally simple. The Swarm grew stronger with every conquest, while the Confederacy grew weaker with every lost commander we have. Reports from the outer defense perimeter, her tactical officer called out, and his voice carried that same hollow tone they all had now after years of unending bad news. "Show me," Celerin said, and she already knew what she would see. Display shifted to show the outer a system where her remaining defense fleet was supposed to hold the line for at least another week, but the Vorkian armada had arrived early and in greater numbers than intelligence had predicted. 3,000 combat vessels filled the display like a swarm of locusts, and her fleet numbered barely 400, and most of those were damaged from the previous engagement at Kelthira Station. "They will reach firing range in 6 hours, the tactical officer reported. Celerin looked around her command center at the faces of species who had been allies for 3 centuries, and she saw the same exhausted resignation in all of them. The crystalline Ixarians who had contributed their superior shield technology, and the massive Gromoth who served as the Confederacy's heavy assault troops, and the small, quick Pathrani, whose pilots were legendary, and none of it had mattered. The Vorkian Swarm adapted to every tactic and overcame every defense and rebuilt faster than anyone could. "Destroy them! Get me the Council's Celerin," ordered the holographic projector. Activated, and 6 faces appeared before her, representing the leadership of the 6 species that made up the Confederacy. And every one of them looked as tired as she felt. "The Swarm has arrived," she told them without preamble, because there was no point in softening the truth. "Any more? How long do we have?" asked Council Prime. Dexarone in his crystalline face reflected the light and fractured pattern. 6 hours until they engaged the fleet, Celerin replied, and then added what they all knew was coming. "Perhaps 2 days, until they reach Kelthira Prime itself." The silence stretched across the communication channel, and Celerin watched as the council members exchanged glances that said everything without words. "We should discuss surrender terms," said May. Councillor Varith, and the Gromoth's deep voice was barely a rumble. "The Swarm does not accept surrender," Celerin reminded them, and they all knew this, but desperation made people grasp at impossible hopes. "Then we die," Vroth said simply. "No," interrupted Councillor Pix, and the small Pathrani's voice was sharp with sudden energy. "No, there is one more option." "What option?" Lexarone demanded. "We have tried everything, and lost everything trying the beacon." Pix said. "The ancient beacon we discovered on Kelthira Prime 20 years ago?" Celerin felt her primary heart skip because she remembered the beacon, and remembered how it had been declared a mystery and filed away as an archaeological curiosity. "That beacon is thousands of years old," she protested. "We don't even know what species built it, or if it still functions." "We know it points somewhere," Pix insisted. "We know it was designed to send a distress signal across impossible distances, and we know we have nothing else left to try." The council chamber fell silent again, and Celerin ran calculations in her mind about odds that were already impossible becoming even more remote. "Activated," Dexarone finally declared. "If nothing else, our deaths might warn whoever receives the signal about the Swarm." The council dissolved, and Celerin turned back to her tactical display, where the red signatures of the Vorkian fleet continued their inexorable advance. She sent the order down to the surface to the archaeological site, where the beacon waited in a chamber carved from living rock, and within the hour her communications officer reported that the beacon was active and transmitting on frequencies. "That should not exist." Any response? Celerin asked without much hope. "Nothing, Commander," came the reply. She had not expected anything different because the beacon was ancient, and whatever civilization had built, it was probably dusk by now, and even if someone received the signal, they would never arrive in time. The hours crawled past, and her fleet formed defensive positions around Kelthora. Prime and evacuations continued on the surface, but there was nowhere to evacuate to any Marie Kelthera. Prime was the last major population center, and if it fell, the Confederacy would be scattered remnants, fleeing into the dark between stars. Fleet engagement in 30 minutes. Tactical report. Edselen watched the countdown and prepared herself for the end and wondered if the Vorkians would at least make it quick then. Her communications officer jerked upright with a sound of surprise that cut through the tension like a blade. Commander, we have a response to the beacon. He practically shouted. Single ship signature just dropped out of FTL at the system edge. The tactical display shifted and showed a new contact, and Celerin felt confusion war with desperate hope. One ship, and just one against 3,000 Vorkian combat vessels. Identify. She ordered. Unknown configuration. Tactical replied. Hull mass suggests Dreadnought class, and they are broadcasting on standard channels. Put them through a human face, appeared on the display, and Celerin had never seen a human before, but she recognized a warrior when she saw one. The human had dark skin and close-cropped hair, and eyes that had seen too much combat in his uniform. Bore symbols she did not recognize. This is Captain Marcus Chen of the Terran Union Space Command vessel. Indomitable, the human said, and his voice was calm despite the tactical situation. We received your distress call, and we are here to help. Celerin stared at the human and felt something she had not felt in years. She felt hope trying to take root in her chest, despite every rational thought telling her that one ship could not matter. Captain Chen, she replied and kept her voice steady. I am Commander Celerin of the Kelthari Confederacy, and I appreciate your response, but you should know that we face an enemy fleet of 3,000 vessels. Chen smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. He said, that's why we brought friends, but they will need a few days to arrive, and in the meantime, my crew and I will do what we can. How many crew? Celerin asked. 800 on my ship, Chen replied, and I am deploying 200 Marines to your surface to help with defensive positions. 200 soldiers and 800 crew against millions of Vorkian combat units, and Celerin did not know whether to laugh or cry at the futility, but the human was here and offering help, and she would take whatever she could get. Transmitting tactical data now, she said, and Captain Chen, thank you for coming, even if we cannot win. The human's smile grew sharper. Commander, he said, you have not seen humans fight yet, and we have a saying back home. We didn't come here to lose. The communication cut, and Celerin watched as the single human dreadnought began moving toward the Vorkian fleet, and 200 dropships descended toward Kelthora Prime. She did not believe they could win, but for the first time in 8 years, she believed they might make the Vorkians pay dearly for their victory, and perhaps that would have to be enough. The human dropships descended through Kelthora Prime's atmosphere like falling stars, and Celerin watched through her tactical feeds with growing bewilderment at what she was seeing. Each dropship carried only 10 Marines, and she had commanded armies large enough to conquer continents, and yet here were 200 soldiers arriving to face an invasion force that would number in the millions once the Vorkians made landfall. The dropships touched down at the primary spaceport, which was exactly where every tactical model predicted the Vorkians would strike first, and the humans immediately began fortifying positions with an efficiency that spoke of long practice. As Celerin activated a communication channel to the surface and connected to the human commander leading the ground forces. A woman's face appeared on screen, and she wore armor that looked both advanced and battered, with symbols painted on the shoulder plates and scars across the faceplate. I am Commander Celerin. She began. You are Sergeant Maria Kowalski, the human interrupted. 1st Battalion, 3rd Regiment. Terran Marines? And before you ask, yes, we know we are heavily outnumbered. Celerin felt her secondary hearts clench because the human said it so casually, as if being outnumbered by thousands to one was merely an inconvenience. Sergeant, I have 50,000 troops on this world, Celerin said carefully, and we have been losing ground for 8 years, and I do not understand what 200 soldiers can accomplish. Kowalski's expression did not change with respect. Commander, you have 50,000 troops who have been losing for 8 years. She replied, "We have 200 Marines who have never lost and do not plan to start now." The sheer confidence in those words should have been arrogance, but Kowalski delivered them with the flat certainty of someone stating basic facts. The Vorkians will land approximately 10,000 combat units in the first wave, Celerin. Position will be overrun in minutes, then we will make those minutes count, Kowalski said. Transmitting our defensive positions now, and Commander, we would appreciate any support your forces can provide, but we will hold this spaceport with ore. Without it, the channel closed, and Celerin stared at the tactical display showing the human positions, and they made no sense according to any doctrine. She knew the humans had created overlapping fields of fire that left their own positions exposed, and had placed heavy weapons in locations that could not be reinforced, and had apparently decided that the concept of a fallback position was optional. "This is insane," her tactical officer muttered. "Deploy the 7th Regiment to support them," Celerin ordered anyway, "and make sure our artillery can provide fire support." In orbit, Captain Chen's dreadnought was doing something equally inexplicable. He was accelerating directly toward the Vorkian fleet, which had just begun its attack. Run the Unavoidable was a massive vessel, but it was still one ship against 3,000, and Chen was charging into their formation like he intended to ram the entire fleet. "Captain Chen, what are you doing?" Celerin demanded over the command channel creating. "An opportunity," Commander Chen replied, and his voice remained infuriatingly calm. "I am going to get their attention, and when I do, I need your fleet to hit their left flank with everything you have." "They will destroy you, Celerin," protested they. "We'll try," Chen agreed, "but humans are very hard to kill, and I have no intention of making it easy for them." The Indomitable opened fire, and its weapon systems were unlike anything in the Confederacy arsenal, and, instead of the standard plasma, batteries or missile pods, the human ship deployed what appeared to be solid projectiles accelerated to relativistic speeds. Kinetic rounds punched through Vorkian shields like they were not there and shredded armor plating that had withstood years of Confederacy attacks. There were 3,000 enemy ships, and they all turned their weapons on the Indomitable in space, lit up with enough firepower to crack a Planet Chen ship, twisted and rolled with an agility that should have been impossible for something so large, and its shields flared and buckled but held, and it kept firing and kept advancing. Now Commander Chen transmitted, "Hit them now." Celerin gave the order, and her fleet struck the Vorkian left flank in 4. The first time in years, she watched as enemy ships actually broke formation because they were caught between two threats instead of overwhelming one. Battle became chaos, and the Indomitable was taking horrific damage, but Chen kept his ship in the fight and kept drawing fire and kept creating openings for the Confederacy fleet to exploit. In the surface, the Vorkian landing craft began their descent, and Celerin switched her attention to the ground battle feeds. 10,000 Vorkian combat units landed in the first wave, and they were a nightmare made real and adaptive combat drones that could reconfigure their weapons. Mid-battle and berserker units that could tear through armor plating with their claws, they hit the human positions like a tidal wave of metal and fury, and the humans did not break Celerin. Watched through reconnaissance drones as the Marines opened fire with weapons that seemed designed to cause maximum destruction and explosive rounds that detonated inside targets, and energy weapons that burned through armor, and projectile weapons that fired so fast they sounded like continuous thunder ray. Vorkian berserker unit crashed into a human position and tore apart the fortifications, and the 3 Marines in that position did not retreat, and one lost his weapon and drew a knife and actually stabbed the berserker unit repeatedly until it stopped moving. Kossable breathed, her tactical officer, but it was happening, and the humans were holding. And not just holding, but advancing into the Vorkian lines whenever they saw an opening, and one Marine ran out of ammunition and beat a combat drone to death with the empty weapon. Sergeant Kowalski was everywhere, and her armor was scorched and dented, and she had lost her helmet somewhere, but she kept fighting and kept directing her troops and kept refusing to give ground. The Confederacy troops Celerin had sent to support the humans arrived and stared in shock at what they were witnessing. 7th Regiment, Kowalski's voice crackled over the command channel. "Welcome to the party, and take positions on our flanks, and when I give the word, we are going to push these machines back to their landing craft." "Sergeant, we cannot push forward," protested The 7th commander, we need to establish defensive. We push or we die, Kowalski. Cut him off, and I am not dying today. She did not wait for agreement, and she rallied her Marines and charged directly into the Vorkian center and the humans. Fought with a savagery that seemed almost pathological. They took wounds that should have been fatal and kept fighting, and when their armor failed, they fought without it. And when their weapons ran dry, they used whatever came to hand. One Marine had his leg blown off below the knee, and he applied a tourniquet and kept firing from a prone position, and another was caught in an explosion that should have killed her instantly, but she crawled out of the crater and rejoined her squad. Zalaran realized, with growing horror and awe, that the humans were not just skilled warriors, and they were something else entirely. They evolved for war in a way her people had never needed to be, and every instinct they had was honed for combat, and they simply did not have the same concept of when a battle was lost in orbit. Chen's ship was dying, and hull breaches vented atmosphere, and entire sections were on fire, and his shields had failed 10 minutes ago. "Captain, you need to withdraw," Zalaran urged. Not yet, Chen replied, and his image on screen showed a man covered in blood from a head wound but still standing. "Not until I finish this." The Indomitable turned hard and accelerated toward a Vorkian heavy cruiser, and Zalaran understood what Chen intended a moment before he did it. "Captain, no," she shouted, but Chen rammed his dreadnought directly into the Vorkian cruiser at full acceleration, and the impact released enough kinetic energy to vaporize both ships. 30 seconds later, Chen's voice came through on the emergency channel. "Indomitable to Confederacy Command," he said, and he sounded slightly winded. "Crew successfully evacuated via emergency transport, and that was for the 50 systems you monsters took from our new friend." Zalaran felt her primary heart stop because the human had just sacrificed his ship and somehow survived, and was already planning his next move on the surface. Kowalski's advance had broken the Vorkian center, and the machines were actually retreating and retreating because 200 humans had hit them so hard and so fast that their tactical algorithms could not process what was happening. Commander Kowalski transmitted, "We have secured the spaceport, and we are establishing a perimeter for the next wave." "Next wave?" Zalaran repeated numbly. "The expeditionary fleet will be here in 72 hours. Chun's voice cut in, "and we brought friends, and Sergeant, excellent work, and drinks are on me. When this is over," Zalaran looked at her tactical display and saw that the Vorkian fleet was pulling back to regroup, and saw that her own forces had suffered minimal casualties because Chen had taken the brunt of the enemy attacks. She saw 200 human Marines holding a position that 50,000 Confederacy troops had been ready to abandon, and she realized that perhaps defeat was not inevitable after all. "Captain Chen," she said slowly, "what are humans?" There was a pause, and then Chen laughed, and it was a tired sound but genuine. "We are what happens when evolution forgets to teach a species how to quit," he replied, "and Commander, you are about to see exactly what that means." The 3 days that followed the first engagement changed everything. Zalaran thought she knew about warfare, and she spent most of that time watching the human Marines in action through her reconnaissance network. Sergeant Kowalski had not been exaggerating when she said they would hold the spaceport and the Vorkians through wave after wave of combat units at the human positions, and each wave broke against defenses that should have crumbled hours ago. What fascinated and disturbed Zalaran in equal measure was how the humans approached combat itself. The Confederacy species fought to win with minimal casualties and efficient use of resources, and they retreated when positions became untenable and regrouped to fight another day. Humans fought like every battle was the last battle they would ever face. She watched a squad pinned down by Vorkian heavy weapons, and instead of calling for support or withdrawing, they split up in 3. Marines provided suppressing fire while 2 others flanked the enemy position, and the 5th one ran straight at the Vorkians and drew their fire until his squad mates could destroy them. The Marine who had charged the position took 17 hits, and his armor was shredded, and he had 3 broken ribs and a punctured lung. According to the medical, Riodoch was back in action 6 hours later. "How is that possible?" Zalaran demanded of Captain Chen, who had transported to her flagship after the Indomitable's destruction. Chen looked tired. but his eyes held that same sharp focus she had seen in every human she had encountered. "We have very good medical technology," he explained, "and our bodies are built to take damage, keep functioning, and humans evolved on a world that tried to kill us every single day. That does not explain the psychology," Celerin pressed. "Your Marines fight past the point where any rational being would surrender." Chen smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. "Commander, have you ever heard the saying that humans are the only species that will look at something that can kill them and decide to fight it anyway?" He asked. "We spent our entire evolutionary history being both predator and prey, and we learned that the only way to survive was to never give up." He pulled up a holographic display showing human history, and Celerin saw images of humans fighting with primitive weapons against creatures larger and stronger than themselves. She saw cities reduced to rubble and humans rebuilding them, and saw plagues that killed millions and humans adapting and surviving. She saw wars that lasted for decades, and soldiers who kept fighting even when their nations had fallen. "We are not stronger than you physically," Chen continued, "and we are not smarter than the Ixarians, and we do not have the technology advantage we would like, but we have one thing that the Vorkians cannot adapt to." "What is that?" Celerin asked. "We are too stubborn to die," Chen replied. Simply the conversation was interrupted by proximity alarms, and Celerin's tactical officer called out that multiple FTL signatures were appearing at the system edge. Terran Expeditionary Fleet had arrived. 40 warships dropped out of faster-than-light travel in perfect formation, and Celerin felt her breath catch, because each ship was a match for the Indomitable, and they were accompanied by troop transports and support vessels. A new face appeared on the command channel, and this was a woman with gray hair and a uniform that bore more symbols than Chen's and eyes that had seen entire civilizations rise and fall. "This is General Sarah Okonkwo, commanding the Terran Expeditionary Fleet," she announced. "All Confederacy forces are to coordinate with my tactical officers, and we are here to end this war." The fleet moved into position with a precision that spoke of long practice, and Celerin watched as transport ships began deploying troops to the surface. 50,000 Terran soldiers joined the 200 Marines already fighting, and suddenly the tactical situation shifted from desperate defense to possible counterattack. General Okonkwo transported to Celerin's flagship and brought with her a presence that filled the command center. "Commander Celerin," she said, and her voice carried absolute authority, "I need a complete tactical briefing on the Vorkian swarm, and I need it now." They spent 6 hours reviewing 8 years of warfare, and Okonkwo absorbed every detail with the focus of someone who had fought 1,000 battles. "You have been fighting them wrong," she finally declared. Celerin felt her spines bristle with indignation, but Okonkwo raised a hand. "That is not a criticism, Commander," she continued. "You have been fighting a conventional war against an enemy that adapts to conventional tactics, and humans stopped fighting conventional wars about 10,000 years ago." She pulled up a display showing human military doctrine, and Celerin read concepts that seemed designed by someone. Insane strategic depth through calculated sacrifice and weapons. Designed to maximize enemy casualties even at high cost to user, and tactical retreats that led enemies into prepared kill zones. "The Vorkians adapt to predictable behavior," Okonkwo explained. "So we will be unpredictable, and they rebuild faster than you can destroy them. So we will not just destroy them, but make them afraid to engage." "Machines do not feel fear," Celerin protested. "No," Okonkwo agreed, "but their central intelligence does understand probability and risk assessment, and we are going to teach it that attacking humans carries an unacceptable cost." The general outlined her strategy, and it was audacious to the point of madness. They would not defend Kelthera Prime, and instead they would use it as bait and draw the Vorkians into committing their full force, and then the combined fleet would strike at their supply lines and processing nodes. "We will lose the capital," Celerin objected. "We will evacuate the capital and then take it back," Okonkwo corrected. "And in the process, we will teach the swarm that humans do not know how to quit." On the surface, Sergeant Kowalski received new orders and integrated the fresh troops into her defensive network, and the Vorkians were massing for another assault. This wave numbered 50,000 combat units, and it was the largest force they had Deployed Yetzelarin watched the feeds and saw Kowalski organizing the defenses with the same calm efficiency she had shown from the beginning. The sergeant's armor was patched with quickseal foam, and her weapons were mismatched pieces taken from fallen enemies, and she had a scar across her face that would never fully heal all units. This is Kowalski. She transmitted the enemy is coming in force, and they think they can break us because they have never fought humans before, and today we teach them why that is a mistake. The Vorkians attacked, and this time they used new tactics and flanking maneuvers, and concentrated their berserker units for breakthrough. Saltzan, the humans, adapted faster. Kowalski had anticipated the new tactics because she understood that the Vorkians would learn from previous engagements, and she had prepared responses. That seemed to violate every principle of defensive warfare when the berserkers concentrated for a breakthrough. Her forces fell back, but not in retreat, and they led the enemy into a killing field, where human heavy weapons and Confederacy artillery had perfect overlapping fire. When the Vorkians tried to flank, they found positions that appeared abandoned, but were actually rigged with enough explosives to create new craters. The battle raged for 12 continuous hours, and Kowalski did not. Reston did not slow, and when her armor's power supply failed, she continued fighting in the unpowered. Exoskeleton Vorkian berserker caught her during a charge and tore her left arm off at the elbow. She used the severed limb as a club to beat the berserker until her squad mates could reach her, and then she calmly applied a tourniquet and returned to directing the battle cellar. Watched this happen and felt something shift in her understanding of what was possible that should have killed her. She whispered. Probably Chen agreed from beside her, but telling Kowalski something should kill her is just going to make her more determined to prove you wrong. The sergeant survived, and the humans held, and when the Vorkians finally withdrew, they had lost 30,000 units to the humans' 500 casualties, and those 500 casualties included 200 soldiers who were already being revived in medical bays and would return to combat within days. David, how Celerin asked. We have medical technology that can revive soldiers up to 6 minutes after clinical death, Chen explained, and we use combat stimulants that would kill most species, but just make humans more focused. And we have been refining combat medicine for our entire history. He pulled up statistics, and Celerin saw survival rates that should have been impossible. Humans could survive losing up to 40% of their blood and continue fighting, and could operate with injuries that would incapacitate any Confederacy species, and had pain tolerances that seemed almost supernatural. You are not just warriors, she realized. You are evolutionarily designed for sustained warfare. Yes, Chen confirmed, and now we teach the Vorkians what that means, General. Okonkwo's fleet struck the Vorkian supply lines with devastating precision, and human tactics proved impossible for the swarm to counter. They used suicide runs that worked because the pilots survived and held positions past the point of logic, because those positions became rallying points, and fought with a ferocity that made the Vorkians' probability algorithms conclude that engagement was inefficient. 3 weeks after the Terran fleet arrived, the Vorkians withdrew from Kelthera Prime for the first time in 8 years. The war room aboard General Okonkwo's flagship was filled with representatives from all 6 Confederacy species, and for the first time in 8 years they were discussing offensive operations instead of managed ret. Tretzelarin studied the holographic displays showing reclaimed systems in Vorkian positions, falling back, and casualty reports that actually favored their forces. It felt like waking from a nightmare, except the nightmare had lasted nearly a decade, and she still half expected to wake up and find it all a dream. We have momentum, General Okonkwo declared, and her voice cut through the murmurs of conversation. And the Vorkians are confused because their algorithms are not designed to handle opponents who refuse to behave. Rationally define? Rationally asked Council Prime. The Xeron in his crystalline form refracted the light into rainbow patterns. Okonkwo smiled, and it was the expression of a predator. The Vorkians expect opponents to value survival over victory. She explained they expect retreats when casualties reach certain thresholds, and they expect forces to break when positions become untenable. And humans do not do any of those things. She pulled up footage from recent engagements, and Celerin watched. battles she had already seen, but now viewed through the lens of Okonkwo's analysis. Human forces taking casualties that should have triggered withdrawal, but instead pressing forward in positions held past every logical breaking point, and soldiers fighting with injuries that should have rendered them combat ineffective. This is not sustainable, protested Counselor Vareth, and the massive Gramoth shifted uncomfortably. Your forces cannot maintain these casualty rates. You are correct, Okonkwo. Agreed, which is why we are not going to maintain them. She changed the display to show Confederacy forces in recent engagements, and Celerin saw her own troops fighting differently than they had before. Units holding positions longer in counterattacks, launched with more aggression, and retreats executed as tactical maneuvers instead of desperate flight. You are learning, Okonkwo continued, and that is what will win this war, because the Vorkians cannot learn, and they can only adapt to what they have seen before. Captain Chen stepped forward and activated another display. Commander Celerin, your forces have cut their casualty rates by 40% in the last 3 weeks. He reported, not because you are fighting less, but because you are fighting smarter. Celerin felt a flush of pride and also shame, because it had taken humans to show them what they should have understood themselves. The key is psychological resilience, Okonkwo explained, and humans have an advantage because we spent 10,000 years fighting each other, and we learned war from opponents who could think and adapt and innovate. She pulled up images of Earth, and Celerin saw a world covered in blue oceans and green continents and white clouds. It looked peaceful until Okonkwo zoomed in to show cities, and beneath the beauty was evidence of countless conflicts. We had 2 world wars that killed over 100 million people, Okonkwo continued, and we survived ice ages and plagues and natural disasters. That should have rendered us extinct, and we kept fighting and kept surviving and kept improving. The general's expression softened slightly. You asked Captain Chen what humans are, she said, looking at Celerin, and the answer is simple. We are survivors, and we are warriors, and we are too stubborn to accept defeat as final. She changed the display again and showed human military doctrine in details, strategic concepts that seemed insane until you understood the underlying philosophy. Pain is temporary, Okonkwo recited. Defeat is permanent, and death is negotiable. Negotiable, repeated Counselor Pix, and the small Pathrani's wings fluttered nervously. We have medical technology that can revive soldiers from clinical death, Chen explained. And we have combat stimulants that push human bodies beyond their normal limits. And we have prosthetics that can replace lost limbs and return soldiers to active duty. He pulled up medical files, and Celerin saw reports that made her secondary. Hearts clenched. Sergeant Kowalski had been revived from clinical death twice during the defense of Kelthra Prime. Marine named Jackson had lost both legs and received prosthetic replacements and returned to combat within a week. Another soldier had suffered burns across 60% of his body and was expected to return to active duty in a month. This is not war. Roth rumbled. This is madness. No, Okonkwo corrected quietly. This is what happens when you fight an enemy that will not stop, and cannot be negotiated with, and will not show mercy. She looked at each of the council members in turn. The Vorkians have been winning because they are relentless, she continued. So we taught them that humans are more relentless. Now we will teach you to be relentless as well. Over the following weeks, the combined Terran Confederacy forces began offensive operations, and Celerin watched as her people adapted human tactics to their own capabilities. The Kelthari, with their 4 arms, became masters of sustained defensive fire and holding positions. Through overwhelming assaults, the Ixarians, with their crystalline bodies, learned to use their natural resilience to anchor defensive lines. The massive Gromoth became shock troops, who could break Vorkian formations with directed charges. The quick Pathrani learned human hit-and-run tactics and turned their superior speed into devastating raids. Even the methane-breathing Zeltok and the aquatic the Shens found ways to adapt human doctrine to their unique biology. The Vorsians tried to counter, but their algorithms were designed for conventional warfare. Against conventional opponents, they had never faced an enemy that treated death as an inconvenience. They had never fought opponents who learned and adapted faster than their own tactical processors. They had never encountered forces that would sacrifice ships and soldiers to create tactical advantages. The first major confederacy Offensive was the liberation of Tarka Station, and it had been a Vorkian stronghold for 6 years. General Okonkwo signed the operation to Confederacy forces with human advisors, and Celerin led the assault herself. She watched as her fleet approached the heavily defended station and felt her old fears rising because conventional wisdom said this attack would fail. Commander came Captain Chen's voice over her private channel. "You are thinking too much. The station has overlapping defensive fields," Celerin protested, "and our casualties will be severe." "Yes," Chen agreed. "So make those casualties count, and remember that pain is temporary, but victory is forever." Celerin took a deep breath and gave the order to attack. Her fleet struck with precision, and she used tactics that would have been unthinkable months ago. Ships damaged beyond conventional fighting capacity rammed Vorkian vessels instead of withdrawing boarding. Parties continued their assaults even after taking heavy casualties, and when the Vorkians adapted, she changed tactics and adapted faster. Battle lasted 18 hours, and the Confederacy lost 30 ships and 4,000 troops. But they took Tarka Station, and for the first time since the war began, a major Vortian stronghold fell. Celerin stood on the command deck of the captured station and looked at the bodies of her fallen soldiers and felt grief war with pride. "They fought like humans," she said to Chen, who had transported over after the battle. "No," Chen replied gently. "They fought like themselves, and they learned that they are stronger than they believed." General Okonkwo's voice came over the fleet-wide channel. "All forces, this is Okonkwo," she announced. "Tarka Station is ours, and this is just the beginning." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. "The Vorkians have been winning because they believed they were inevitable," she continued. "But we have shown them they are not, and now we show them what true inevitability looks like." The plan she outlined was audacious beyond anything the Confederacy had attempted. They would not just reclaim lost systems, but strike at the Vorkian central node itself. Core intelligence that controlled the entire swarm. "This will cost us dearly," Okonkwo admitted, "and many will not return. But if we succeed, we end this war, and if we fail, we still prove that we never surrendered." Celerin looked at the assembled officers and saw the same determination she felt they had learned from the humans, and learned that defeat was not inevitable. They had learned that pain was temporary, and victory was worth any cost. They had learned that sometimes the only way to win was to refuse to lose. "When do we begin?" Celerin asked General. Okonkwo smiled. "Tomorrow," she replied, "because humans do not believe in wasting time." Celerin realized that she believed they could actually win, not because victory was guaranteed, but because they would fight until they did. The Vorkian Central Node was a fortress built from the remains of 17 conquered civilizations, and it orbited a dead star in a system that had been stripped of all life. Centuries ago, General Okonkwo stood before the holographic display showing their target, and every officer in the war room understood that this battle would determine the fate of the entire war. The Central Node controls every Vorkian unit across 1,000 systems, she explained, and destroying it will not destroy the swarm, but it will fragment their coordination and give us time to eliminate them system by system.
Ow!
Celerin studied the tactical data and felt her primary heart clench because the node was defended by over 10,000 ships and had defensive shields that could withstand a supernova. "We have assembled every available vessel from both our forces," she reported, "and our combined fleet numbers. Just under 3,000 ships." The numbers were not in their favor, but Okonkwo merely nodded, as if she had expected nothing different. "Then we will make those 3,000 count," the general replied. Captain Chen brought up the battle plan, and it was the most complex operation Celerin had ever seen. The fleet would split into 5 task forces, and each would strike a different section of the node's defenses. Simultaneously, human forces would lead the main assault, while Confederacy forces created diversions and struck supply lines. "This is a suicide mission," stated Counselor Veroth. Bluntly, yes, Okonkwo agreed without hesitation, "which is why I will be leading the main assault personally." The room fell silent because no one had expected the Supreme Commander to put herself in the most dangerous position. "General, that is not," Chen began, but Okonkwo cut him off. "I've asked soldiers across 2 civilizations to die for this cause." she said quietly, and I will not ask them to go where I am unwilling to follow. Celerin felt a surge of respect because she had commanded troops for decades and had always led from the rear as doctrine demanded, but humans were different, and their leaders fought alongside their soldiers. I will accompany you, Celerin declared, and ignored the protests from her own staff as will I. Rumbled Vrothan by one, the other commanders volunteered, and Okonkwo accepted each with a nod. Then we go together, she said, and we end this. The fleet assembled at the staging point, and Celerin walked through her flagship, looking at the faces of her crew. They were afraid because fear was rational, but they were also determined because they had learned that determination could overcome fear. Sergeant Kowalski was leading the main boarding force, and she had recovered from her injuries, though. Her left arm was now a prosthetic that she claimed worked better than the original. Ready for one last fight, Sergeant Celerin? Asked. Kowalski grinned, and it was an expression that promised violence. Commander, I was born ready, she replied. And today we teach these machines that humans do not lose. The fleet jumped to FTL and emerged at the node system in perfect formation. The Vorkian response was immediate and overwhelming, and space filled with so many ships that they blocked out the stars. All forces engage, Okonkwo ordered, and her voice was calm despite the chaos erupting around them. The battle began, and it was worse than anything Celerin had experienced in 8 years of warships. Died in the first minutes, and entire squadrons vanished in nuclear fire, and the Vorkian defenses were exactly as formidable as intelligence had predicted. But the combined fleet kept advancing. Human ships took damage that should have destroyed them, and kept fighting. Confederacy vessels learned to use human tactics and turn suicidal charges into tactical advantages. Ixarians discovered that their crystalline hulls could survive direct hits that obliterated conventional armor. The Gromoth captains found that ramming attacks could breach Vorkian shields. The Pathrani pilots flew attack patterns that the enemy computers could not predict. Slowly, and at terrible cost, they forced their way through the defensive perimeter. General Okonkwo's flagship took a direct hit that killed half the crew, but she transferred command to the secondary bridge and continued. The assault captain Chen's new ship lost its engines, and he used the remaining momentum to ram a Vorkian command vessel. Counselor Vroth's dreadnought was boarded, and the massive Gromoth personally led the defense and threw Vorkian berserkers out the airlocks with his bare hands. Still, they advanced. Adelerin watched the casualty reports climb in and knew they had already lost over 1,000 ships. The price was devastating, but they were winning, and that was all that mattered. Boarding teams launch. Okonkwo ordered hundreds of assault craft launch from the surviving ships and raced toward the node itself. Sergeant Kowalski led the first wave, and her marines hit the outer hull with shaped charges and plasma cutters. The Vorkians had prepared for boarding actions, and defensive drones met the attackers at every breach point, but humans had spent 10,000 years perfecting close-quarters combat, and Kowalski's teams fought through corridors filled with death. They lost soldiers every meter, but they kept advancing. Celerin led a Kelthari assault team through a different section and discovered that her forearms gave her an advantage in the tight spaces. They fought for hours through endless corridors and faced waves of defenders that never tired and never retreated. This is insane, gasped one of her soldiers. Yes, Celerin agreed, and we learned insanity from the best deep in the node. General Okonkwo led the demolition team personally, and they fought their way to the central processing core. The Vorkians threw everything at them, and Okonkwo took a plasma round to the chest that should have killed her instantly. Her armor's medical systems kept her alive, but she was dying, and everyone knew it. General, we need to evacuate you, Chen insisted over the command channel. Negative, Okonkwo replied, and her voice was weak but determined. Finish the mission. She held the corridor against a Vorkian counterattacked and gave the demolition team time to reach the core. Her soldiers begged her to fall back, but she refused. Someone has to hold this position, she said simply, and I volunteered. Celerin watched through tactical feeds as Okonkwo fought alone against impossible odds. The general was wounded and dying, but she held that corridor for 17 minutes, long enough for the demolition charges to be placed, long enough for the team to reach minimum safe distance, long enough to matter charges. Set came the report, detonating in 30 seconds. All forces withdraw. Okonkwo ordered, mission accomplished. She never made it to the extraction point. The charges detonated, and the Vorkian Central node tore itself apart from the inside. The explosion was visible across the entire system, and every Vorkian ship suddenly went dark as their coordination network failed. The surviving fleet withdrew, and Celerin stood on her damaged bridge and looked at the casualty reports. They had lost over 1,500 ships and 30,000 troops. General Sarah Okonkwo was among the dead, along with countless others who had sacrificed everything but. The Vorkian swarm was broken. Over the following months, the Terran Confederacy Alliance hunted down the remaining Vorkian fragments and reclaimed every lost system without central coordination. The machines fell to conventional tactics. The war that had lasted 8 years ended in 8 months. Celerin stood at the memorial wall on Kelthora Prime and looked at the names of the Folan General. Okonkwo's name was first among them, and beside it were the names of thousands of humans and Confederacy soldiers who had died to win freedom. Captain Chen stood beside her, and his face showed the same exhaustion. In grief she felt. "We won," Celerin said quietly, "but the cost was worth it." Chen finished because the alternative was extinction, and General Okonkwo knew that, and so did everyone who fought. He placed his hand on the memorial wall. "She taught us that leadership means being willing to pay the highest price," he continued, "and we will honor her by never forgetting what she gave us." The Kelthari Confederacy and Terran Union signed a formal alliance that day, and it was the first true pan-galactic coalition based on mutual respect and shared sacrifice. Celerin was promoted to Grand Admiral and given command of the Combined Defense Forces captain. Chen received the Indomitable 3 and continued to serve with the same dedication he had shown from the beginning. Sergeant Kowalski retired from active duty and became an instructor teaching Confederacy soldiers human combat doctrine. The galaxy had changed, and the Confederacy species had learned lessons they would never forget they had learned. That defeat was only inevitable if you accepted it. They had learned that pain was temporary, but victory was forever. They had learned that sometimes the only way to win was to refuse to lose. At the dedication ceremony for the memorial, Celerin spoke. "To the assembled crowd, we were dying," she said, "and we had accepted our fate because we could not imagine victory." She looked at the human delegation and felt gratitude deeper than words. "Then humans arrived, and they taught us something fundamental." She continued, "They taught us that you do not need to imagine victory to achieve it, and you only need to refuse defeat." She raised her forearms in salute. "General Okonkwo told us that humans are what happens when evolution forgets to teach a species how to quit," Celerin declared, "and today we adopt that philosophy as our own." The Confederacy Council had voted unanimously to adopt a new motto, and Celerin spoke it now, for the first time, officially. "We do not yield," she proclaimed, and her voice rang across the memorial grounds. The assembled soldiers, both human and Confederacy, repeated the words, "We do not yield."